Hello, my name is Mentor Valerie or Valadriel, and this is week 1 retouching of the global ZEPETOR class. We're gonna start this week with IBIS Paint familiarization. It's very important to get proficient in whatever editing app that you use, so we're using IBIS Paint. Elements that we're gonna need to be good in are layers, blending mode, pen fade, overlay, lighting, and hair retouching. Sounds like a lot, but actually these are just small basics and they're not as hard as they sound. First of all, what I do when I want to get an interesting pose is I go on the camera tool of ZEPETOR and I pick out a dance or whatever nice moving image that they can provide, and I make my background transparent. Then I take a picture of the still that I want, and that's a still that I'm going to be using on IBIS Paint X. So the first thing that I do is I make sure that I choose 9:16 4K resolution size. 9:16 is the most important because that's what fits the ZEPETOR dimensions. You can set resolution to 4K later on. Once that's open, click OK. Plop the picture right on there. Drag it to size, no big deal there. When they say extract line drawing, say cancel. You don't want that. As you can see, I'm kind of toggling and playing with the reference window just to show you that you can have a window open if you have a reference picture, but in this case, we don't need one. This is just a simple edit. Next, I'm adding a layer underneath the original image with a transparent background, and I made the background black because I want to emulate outer space. So again, what I did was I just used the bucket tool, made it 100% opacity. On my layer 1, I just dropped the black color on it to make a black background. Once that's done, I'm making a third layer and I'm clipping it to the second. So the clipping button is right next to the alpha lock button. This is very important because that way you can color within the lines perfectly of the layer that you want. This is called an overlay. Using the bucket tool again, I'm just dropping a dark blue color on top of layer 3. And I'm adjusting the opacity to about 60 something. That's just my preference. You can apply other blending modes such as darken or multiply, but that won't be necessary this time. However, what is needed is our lighting, and what I'm doing for layer number 4 is exactly that. I am changing my blending mode to add, and I am going to be using a green color for the lighting. For most people, I think an airbrush can do, but I'm gonna share this brush with my mentees. Sorry. But no big deal. An airbrush would work just fine for this part. Well, there is no steadfast way to do a step-by-step process when you do your lighting and shading, because in this picture, I think it's quite dark, so adding some light would always be good. In real time, it's taken me actually about 2 minutes to do all of this, coloring in with the lighting. It's more like a feel, so you kind of see that I'm just working with the colors that are given. It's not that difficult when you break it up into lines. And you can kind of see I'm just changing the brush size here and there. It's just that when there's a big area that doesn't need much definition, like on the smoother part of a sleeve, you don't really need that many lines. Of course, we can't forget about the skin lighting, so I'm going to speed the rest of this up and we'll get on to the lighting of the rest of my avatar. Please remember that this glowing effect is done through the changing of the blending mode from normal to add, and I just got any vibrant color. You can do this too. Any vibrant color plus an airbrush tool of sorts. And there you go. That's it. It's quite simple. Of course, just be aware of your brush size, opacity, and try what works best for you. Just be aware that it's sometimes better to highlight less than to highlight too much. So that's why I choose to highlight only one side of the face, because I don't think it looks very flattering if both were highlighted. Plus the chin. as you can see, and I clipped the extra layer just so I could highlight the wings. Here you can see me using my lighting to contrast the shadow on her fingers, and this is really effective because obviously it shows contrast and depth, and that's always something you like to see in an appealing picture. Same goes for the necklace. The shadow is on the right side of the beads or circles, so I just put a small dot of green, and you can see me accentuating the lights on the pendant. I also want to make it feel like there's some backlighting, and to do this I just highlight the bottom of the top set of wings and the top of the bottom set of wings. I hope that makes sense. I don't highlight all the way around the wings because I think it kind of defeats the purpose of less is more in the sense of highlighting. So that's that for the wings, and I always like to highlight the top of like her elf ears, sometimes nails too, but in this case I didn't feel the need. And lastly, I just did some highlight accents on the jeans because it shows some nice texture. And of course, I would never leave out hair. Since this is just retouching, I'm just drawing over the hair with an add brush. I use a different shade of green, just slightly cooler. Since this is in add mode instead of normal mode for the blending, the color is not as saturated. It doesn't need to be. It can just be a kind of cool tone, and the add mode just deals with the rest. So it's a slightly different shade from her shirt, so it's good that you can differentiate the shade of her hair and her shirt and other clothing details. The strands here, they're kind of loose, and I wanted to make that effect clear, so it just follows the flow of her hair. And it's kind of an intuitive process with straight hair, but for curly hair, that's where the difficulties lie, in my opinion. But straight hair, you can just follow downstrokes, upstrokes. It's not that complicated. Once you get the hang of it, I think editing hair, especially straight hair, can be quite easy, and actually very therapeutic. It's okay if you can't get it the first time, but I think this skill comes in handy, especially when you're drawing hair from scratch. So for shading, I go ahead and create a layer above the overlay. I also kind of like to do it under the hair too, because that's just convenient for me. And I color pick the darkest tone of skin that my avatar has. So you see that my avatar has this kind of purpley shade thanks to the overlay. So I just go a little bit darker, and that's the darkest shade that I will use for her chin, just to accentuate it, and also for the finer shading, like underneath the glasses, underneath the hair strands, around the fingers. Thank goodness it is a 3D image. And also I create some dimension with collarbones, just shading around the add mode. So again, I use the color picker to find the darkest skin undertone, and then I just go a little bit darker than that, and that's the color I'm using for shading. For the hair strands, I shade only one side, not both sides. That's, I think, where a lot of people get lost there, so be careful in that detail. Shade only one side of the hair strand to show that there is a light coming from somewhere. For the background, I just get my brushes that I got off Pinterest. I'll be sharing these brushes with my mentees, but you could easily find brushes on Pinterest, scan the QR code, import it, etc. It will be there on Ibis Paint. They are very accessible with their brushes. You see me just fixing up, touching up some things like the lips. The lips, we can get into that later in more detail, but for now it's just a small retouch. And for the hair, I'm just fixing up this last bit that I missed. And that's it. It helped that we did this edit with like a dark background and dark concept in mind, like outer space, because that way we can just get familiar with using an overlay. I played around with the blending modes also. Thank goodness we have an overlay so that we can change the blending mode and the tone. So that brings us to the end of our first week lecture. I hope that this was informative for you and you learned something new on retouching. Next week, we're going to be drawing hair. Retouching is always a great place to start before drawing, so stay tuned and thank you so much.